Welcome back to iPhone programming. Today what we're going to pick up with is we're going to start talking a little bit more about persistence. To talk about persistence, what we're going to do is we're going to add persistence to a couple different apps. So if you go to the main course website, it's just Rose-Hulman / iOS programming. If you go to this website, you should see some starting code for persistence. So go ahead and click on the link to the starting code, and it should provide you a way to download a .zip file. If you download this .zip file, this will have all the apps that we're going to do for persistence. So if you just double click on it, that will unzip it. So you can see that there are 3 apps in here. They're things we've done before: color slider, tic-tac-toe, and UI view properties. If you want to, you can start with your own versions of these for everything except tic-tac-toe. I added some things to that one. I'm going to start from the zip file for all of them, so if you want to follow along with me, you can just open them up from that zip file. So I'll go ahead and open up what happened there? I'll go ahead and open up this first one. And if I run this is the UI view properties app. Oops, it was set to a provisioning device. Actually, that reminds me, yours might pop up and say missing base SDK. That's because anytime I save a project, you have to set the SDK to the one that you're using. To fix it, if it says missing base SDK, click on the project and click on info. In the build tab, go ahead and change the base SDK to one that doesn't say missing. So for me, it's just set to 3.2 because this was an iPad only app. Yours is surely something different. Once you fix that, you should be able to click on build and run, and you should be able to see this program run. The first thing I'll mention, if you're watching this video at a time where 4.2 is out instead of 3.2, there will be a difference. With 3.2, notice if I click the home button, you can see the app actually closed. And if I click on it to open it back up, it's automatically reset. If you're using 4.2, you're going to have multitasking turned on. If you would like to follow along with the video, I will request, and we'll talk more about this in a later video, I would request that you add a key. So just go ahead and add a row and start typing in application does not run in background. If you type in that key and check the box, then your app will behave like mine. So if you're running 4.2, go ahead and do that, so that if you move the center, then you hit home, the app will close. Mine does doubly now. And then if you reopen it, it always resets the R. So we're going to be talking about persistence, and multitasking changes persistence totally, right? And we'll talk about persistence in a multitasking environment in the next one more. Cool. So what we want to do is we want to add persistence to this app so that it doesn't always open the same way each time. It should open from where you're at last time. In this course, we're going to show you 3 different mechanisms of persistence, all very simple mechanisms. We're going to show you how to use the NSUserDefaults class, how to store something in a plist, and how to make use of the NS coding protocol. The book also shows you SQLite and Core Data. Without a doubt, the best of these is Core Data. But if you look at the book and their second book, More iPhone 3 Development, like the first 7 chapters of More iPhone 3 Development are about Core Data. And it's too much for the time we have remaining in this course, right? So we're going to focus on 3 extremely simple methods. Now note the other thing we did that was in the section used plist, but this one was a static property list. Whereas this one is going to be one that actually we're going to write to. So let's stop talking about it and let's start doing it. So right now we've got this app. It is not persistent. It does a reset each launch, and that's no good, right? Like we want it to store state so that when we come back to it, it picks up where it's left off. So what we're going to start off by doing is we're going to make two functions, a load and a save. You can call them about whatever you want. What I'm going to choose to call them is I'm just going to call them underscore UI load the properties. So this is going to get called whenever we're going to load in the new information, and then we can also save them off. Put them inside the viewcontroller.m file. If you choose to put them at the top, it'll come before you're going to call them, and you don't need prototypes. But if you chose to put them at the bottom of your file, then if you put them down here, then they would need a prototype. If you choose to put them at the bottom, just copy over what's called an internal category. So copy over the category, and this will make the prototype so that the compiler won't yell at you. So we've got two functions, load and save, that do what you would guess. The first thing we have to decide is we have to decide where we want to put these so that the load and the save happens. What we're going to do is we're going to load when the view loads, so that seems rather logical. So if we find view did load, you can see that there's a bunch of stuff going on in here. Where I'm going to add it is near the very end, just before I update the labels. I'm going to load in the UI view properties. So this is where I'm going to load them in inside view did load. Where I'm going to choose to save properties is I'm going to choose to save anytime something changes. I happen to know that with this particular app, anytime something changes, I call update labels. So somewhere in update labels, doesn't matter where, I'm going to choose to save the UI view properties. So if we run it now, let's go ahead and put up the log messages. If we run it now, it should say when it loads, it should say load info from the user defaults, and then anytime you update the view or update the labels, it's going to save stuff. So if I hit center, it's going to update the labels, it's going to save the view. If I change the bounds, it's going to save the info every single time. Now, to be honest, you could choose to save like only when the app closes or something like that, but for this one we're keeping it simple. We're saving just anytime something changes. So if something changes, we save. So it's saying save, and that's all well and good, but you can see that nothing is actually saved because it gets reset. It's just saying saved. But we've at least got them in the right places. So we've got them in the right places. Step 1, check. Step 2, make them actually do something. For this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to use a class called the NSUserDefaults. The NSUserDefaults is set up as a singleton class. If you were to type in NSUserDefaults, the NSUserDefaults have a method called standardUserDefaults. And what this does is this returns a singleton object. The idea of a singleton object is that it is a design pattern to where there's only going to be one instance of this class. So like with smiles, we made a whole bunch of different smiles, so there was one class, many instances. A singleton class is designed to have exactly one instance, so the one and only. NSUserDefaults you would get by calling this method standardUserDefaults. There are a lot of times when this is handy. The nice thing about doing this method is it's globally available, and there's going to be only one of them. And Apple uses this design pattern a lot. This just happens to be the first official time we've seen it. What this class does is it has a lot of methods for getting values from the user defaults. So you can get a lot of different things from the user defaults. Really, you can only get objects from here, but they've got convenience methods to where you can get things like floats, integers, doubles. Really, it's just converting them into an NS number for you, but it's a convenience. You can also get things like arrays. You can also set values in the user defaults, so you can set in, it's got convenience methods for floats, integers, objects. And so what it is it's managed by the system, and you just say get a value. You have to pass it a key. A key in this case is an NS string. Normally keys can be anything that implements a hash function, but in this case they have to be strings. And you can also set things, and you can load things. The difference of this class versus a dictionary is it's actually saved in non-volatile memory, so it's saved forever. The other interesting thing about the NSUserDefaults is it's shared with the Settings app on an iPhone. So if you were to go into the Settings app, sometimes for different apps you can set things for them, and that's shared here with the NSUserDefaults. So let's use it and quit talking about it. So to use it, it's fairly simple. I'll tell you what, I'll just let code completion do it for me. To use, it's fairly simple. Let's go ahead and start off by saving information into the user defaults. The way it looks is you say NSUserDefault standard user defaults. That gets the one and only shared object. And you say set float. So the float that I'm going to save is I'm going to start off by saving the center point. So I'm going to save my views center x. And the key that I'm going to use, I'm going to call key underscore center x. Now it turns out that what you're actually passing in here is you're passing in a string. You could type something like this, like you could just type in a string, but this works out to have disadvantages. And the disadvantages is it's really easy to have spelling mistakes. So pretty much what you will always see with keys is they will get pound defines. And usually it'll just get pound defined as a string that is itself. It can be different, that's totally fine. But the nice thing about pound defines is that they help you if you make spelling mistakes, right? So if you were to swap the letters and the words, so I'll just go do it. So if you were to swap, instead of saying center X, you were to say, like, spell it in the other version of center, it would say, I don't know what you're saying there. But you can see that if you made it just a string, it wouldn't be able to help check your spelling like that. It's also good practice anytime you have a constant to go ahead and make it pound define. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to save off, anytime somebody says save, I'm going to store off my views center X into the key center X. I'm going to store off Y into key center Y. So now anytime this gets called, it'll get saved. Saving is pretty much useless if you don't load it. So let's go load it. And I'm going to show you a few additional details with loading. One of the things that you have to worry about with loading is you have to worry, is this the first time I've ever loaded, is this the first time this app has ever run, right? So you end up doing a lot of your programming with persistence, handling the special case of the first time something ever runs. We're going to show you some better ways to do this later, but for now the best way that we have to do it is to just go ahead and load one of them up. So to call standard user defaults, we'll say give me the float for the key center X, and so it'll give us a float. And if you go into help on this, I held down option and I double clicked on it. One of the things that it'll tell you in here is it'll tell you that if it does not exist, if the key does not exist, this method returns 0. So we're going to use that to our advantage. So if it doesn't exist, it'll return 0. It works out nice in this case that 0 couldn't possibly be a useful value to us. So if it's 0, then we want to just say that there's nothing to load from disk, and just don't do anything. If it's non-zero, then what we want to do is we want to load info from the disk, and we actually want to load it in. And what we're going to do to load it in is we're going to create a new point, called the save center. We're going to load up the X value. I've already called this one from user default, so I just use it. And then we're also going to load up the Y value. And we're going to grab this from the key center Y. And then we're going to take that new point we made and we're going to write it into center. Just to share, this is a reminder from something we did previously. The first question that everybody always has is, why didn't we just do something like this, right? It seems like I could write all of this with only one line of code. I mean, if you try it, you hit Control B. This is why. It says left value required as the left operand of assignee. What's actually happened here with the dot notation is it's actually calling a method for this one, and then it's calling a method for center, and then the result of those methods is a struct, and then it's taking the field of the struct, and this isn't a legal left side of an equation, or this isn't a legal left side of an assignment. So the reason we don't do it like this is because it's not a legal statement. Whereas the one above here, what this actually gets replaced with is it gets replaced with self.myView set center saved center. So you can see that this line gets replaced by this, and notice how there's no equal sign, there's no assignment. So this was totally fine because it gets replaced with this, but the other one is not fine. Alright, so we talked about that back in the properties video as well. So let's go ahead and run this thing and see if something useful happens. So the first thing that happened is it somehow found something to load, which I didn't mean for that to happen. Let's do this. Let's go in here and let's say simulator, reset content and settings, reset. So whenever I'm doing persistence testing, I do this all the time. I just go ahead and reset the simulator, because what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to simulate the first time a user installs it. What is their experience going to be like? And so to check that, you end up resetting the simulator quite a bit when you're doing this type of testing. So the very first time a user runs it, it should do this. It should say load info from user defaults, nothing to load saved on disk. So that printed this line, load info from user defaults. Center must have been 0 because it said nothing to load saved on disk. But then you can see that it did go save the info. So now at this point there is something saved on the disk, right? And what we saved is we saved just the center. So if I change the bounds and I rotate it, those won't get saved, but the center, which is right about there, should get saved. So if I close this down, and you can see the program actually closed, and then if I open it back up, you can see the center got preserved, right? So it's persistent. And likewise, if you run it from here so that you get the log messages, you can see it says load info from user defaults, and then it says load info from the disk, so it actually did load it this time. And you can see also visually that it happened as well. So let's have you do the next one on your own. If you want to play along, what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to save the bounds. So here I want you to load the bounds, and then down here I want you to save the bounds. Also, I'll warn you that if you want it to work correctly, what you should really do is you should reset the simulator so that you don't have anything previously saved, right? Anytime you're doing persistence testing, that's a good thing to do. So take a minute and see if you can make this happen on your own. Should be something you can do. All right, so hopefully you paused the video and did it. So I'm going to do it real quick here. So the way this works is the first thing we need to save it off. I guess the order of operations doesn't matter. But to save off the bounds, it's very similar to what we did before. We're saying set float 4 key we're going to make a key called bounds width and bounds height. And then to load it up, we're going to do just what we did before. We're going to make a new struct. This one is a rect, so bounds is a rect. And then a rect has an origin, which should be the 0. I think that may have defaulted anyway. You could also have done the CG rect make. There are a couple ways you could do it. And then we load up the width, and we load up the height, and then we load up the bounds. So once you load your pound defines, I'm going to go ahead and copy my pound defines out. You should be able to build this and run it. And since I had reset my simulator, it says nothing to load on disk, which is good. I'm going to move my center. I'm going to make my bounds bigger, and I'm going to rotate it some. This time it should preserve center and bounds, but not the rotation, so the size and location should be the same. I close it, I open it, and presto changeo, it's preserving center and it's preserving bounds. The last one, if you wanted to save the transformation, it's exactly the same, so we'll just do it together really quick. A transform, just to help you remember, is a CG affine transform. I think of it in my mind as a 3x3 matrix, but really they only store off 6 values. It's all you really need for doing 2-dimensional rotations and translations are those 6 values. So let's go ahead and store off just those pieces of data. So first we're going to save them. And then we're going to also load them. And this is exactly like what we did before, so I don't mind at all if you just copy paste on this. And then last but not least, we're going to need keys for all of them. And then if I want to make sure there are no weird glitchy things, I'm going to go ahead and reset my simulator prior to doing this test. So the first time up, it should say nothing to load. And if I move the center, move the bounds, and rotate it a little, if I close it and reopen it now, it's preserving center, bounds, and the transform. So this is a quick example of using the NSUserDefaults. It is a very, very, very easy way to store stuff. It does not scale very well, so I wouldn't recommend using it for big projects. But if you've got a really simple persistence need, it might do the trick just fine. There's also a couple things that we could have done to have made our lives easier. And we'll talk about this more later. It turns out that a view can be converted into data because it implements a thing called NS coding, and we could have just converted the whole thing to data and then stored it off as an NS data. But we'll get to better storage techniques later. We just wanted to show you a really simple thing you could do to store data. Let's also go ahead and talk real quickly about where it saves this data to. And this I think is kind of neat. Your iPhone simulator, you can go find inside Finder, which is kind of crazy. The way you find it is you can click on your home directory, so it's actually in the users area already. So you're in the users, and then my user is called FisherDS. From here you click on library. I give that speech because there's a bunch of different libraries, so make sure you grab the one from your home. From here you click on application support, iPhone simulator, and then the version that you're using. So I was using the 3.2 simulator. From here, you want applications. And the applications are big, crazy numbers. These are randomly generated. Well, they're not necessarily randomly generated, but they're generated by the system. And the system believes that this is the name of your app. So everything for your app is inside here. So what's inside here? There are 4 things inside here, and if you had a bunch of apps, there'd be 4 for all of them. There's 3 folders. One folder is called Documents. This is where you're going to do most of your data storage. There's also a document called Temp. This is where you're going to store data that wouldn't get backed up by iTunes. So they're very similar, except for Temp doesn't get backed up. So Temp is where you should like cache data, and then Documents is where you'll do most of your storage. There's also a bundle called UI View Properties. Really, the bundle, I mean, you can think of it as like a zip file, or you can think of it as a folder that it won't show you the inside of. It really is a folder, and it's got a whole bunch of things inside here, but this is your application bundle. And then it's also got a library. In general, you won't interact with the library at all, but this is where NSUserDefaults is. And if you go into Preferences, you can see that there's a property list here called com.yourcompany. The only reason it's called that is because I didn't change the app ID, and so it uses the app ID. But if you double click on it, you can see this is where it's actually storing all your stuff. So you can see this is where it's storing the bounds, the center, and then all that transform information. So it's kind of neat that you can actually see how it's storing this. You can see that it's actually storing it as a plist, and it's actually storing these floats as just NS numbers. So I think that's kind of neat. So that's really all we've got for this demo. NSUserDefaults is a dirt simple way to do data storage. Cool. We'll go ahead and cut this video off here, and then the next one we'll do will be with property list.